Hello, everyone. People in cyberspace. Professor Carolina Lopez-Ruiz is an acknowledged expert in two broad spheres: the comparative study of Greek and Near Eastern mythologies and cultural contact among Greece, Phoenicians, and other groups, with a special interest in ancient Mediterranean religious and Phoenician culture. She has taught, this is something I just learned this week, although she has taught at the Ohio State University in Classics in July, she will be joining the University of Chicago Divinity School for History and Religions. Professor Lopez-Ruiz edited, co-edited, and wrote several volumes in prestigious publishing houses. It's a long list. Colonial Encounters in Ancient Iberia, Phoenician, Greek, and Indigenous Relations in 2009, When the Gods Were Born, Greek Cosmogonies and the Near East, Analyzing the Interrelations Among Greek and West Semitic Creation Narratives in 2010. This is one after the other. The anthology Gods, Heroes, and Monsters, a source books of Greek, Roman, and Near Eastern myths in translation, 2018. Next comes Tartessos and the Phoenicians in Iberia, 2016, and one before that. And her two recent achievements are the co-edited Oxford Handbook of the Phoenician and Punic Mediterranean, 2019, and the book, her latest book, Phoenicians and the Making of the Mediterranean, 2021, in which she offers a new model for the role of the Phoenicians in the Orientalizing period. This year, she enjoyed the Loeb Foundation Fellowship to continue her work on Phoenician primary sources and started to work on a project on decolonizing the Phoenicians. I congratulate Carolina for these achievements, which, among other things, many other things, form part of an ever-increasing awareness of the need to define explicitly what we mean when we say Phoenicians, and for bridging the still lingering chasm between East and West Mediterranean Phoenician scholarship.
Thank you so much, Angelique. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for everybody who brought me here, made it possible. I'm enjoying incredibly meeting so many colleagues and seeing colleagues that I knew from before. For Harvard, especially, thank you, Gil and Ayelet and everybody else who made it possible in other places, especially Andrea Rothstein from Jerusalem, who kind of orchestrated the whole thing. And thank you, the Israel Academy of Science and Humanities. So I'm going to read my talk because it's a fairly complicated and nuanced topic. Feel free to obviously later ask any sorts of questions, general, specific, and or to email me. You have my email. And the handout is just for references and as I go along, or for your own references later on. So if you look at the picture on the first page of the handout. I do want you to and look at the video if you can at home. And I want to start with this image. He was can you hear me? Okay, I'll stay here. He was 25 to 30 years old when he died in a fire in the outskirts of ancient Gadir. He lived in the early 6th century BCE, and archaeologists have named him Matan, a Phoenician name attested in graffiti in the area. His body was found in recent excavations in the center of Gadir, of Cadiz, in southern Spain, which have revealed the original urban core and subsequent phases of Gadir, the colony established traditionally by fire on the western shore of Iberia in the mid to late 9th century BC. In a dramatized video that you could click there, video montage at the archaeological site of Gadir, CSI-style investigators tie the recovery of Matan's remains to the history of Tyre and Gadir and the spread of the Phoenician networks. But here's another fascinating find tying this axis of the Mediterranean, east and west. A set of bullae or clay seals used for papyrus scrolls were found in situ in these early layers. The seals were made with clay from the Levant, apparently, not Iberia, and their iconography of Egyptianizing Phoenician style also signals the high social origins, perhaps coming from a priestly or royal circles. These bullae were, sorry. Yes, yes, yes.
They said they cannot hear you.
They cannot?
Well, and we really want them to. For some reason they say. So I don't know if the microphone. I'm really sorry for this. We checked earlier. No, I usually we really don't do that.
Gil?
And was this like on before?
Yeah.
Yes, it was. Okay. Maybe here.
If I speak close to the microphone, is it better?
Usually we don't have this trouble, but let's see
If I stay closer.
what I say now. Can you hear us well on the
Hear you. Can you hear me?
Zoom? Okay.
We can hear you all right.
They can hear me.
Is it
right.
better if I speak here near the microphone, or is it okay if I stand up? Fine?
Thank you. So sorry for this. Sorry, everybody.
Can they hear me all right? Yes? Somebody has to turn off their volume to maybe on their end. That happens to me sometimes, that I don't have my volume. I'm like, I can't hear anything. Okay, so the bullae. Just to give you something very specific. Again, the clay comes from the Levant. They're very early. They have the marks of papyri attached to them, which is very neat. And they were not broken. They were found in a house oven of a kind that exactly replicates the tanurs found in the Phoenician settlements. In short, somebody had brought or received official documents from the Phoenician homeland and burned them unopened and unread. Whatever the story is there, we will never know. Now, DNA studies on the remains of this Matan and the so-called man of Birsa, that some of you may know, in Carthage have shown that these individuals shared ancestry with Levantine groups, but also with Western European ones, possibly from Iberia or North African Iberia. These men were, in other words, both Phoenician and something else. But here's the question, could we really expect anything different? This complexity marks most individuals. Perhaps a type of hybridity expressed itself culturally too, and somehow shaped Matan's distinctive way of being Phoenician. Or perhaps he did not know or care about his mixed ancestry, lacking the modern thrill of DNA testing. It can be assumed that most Phoenicians of Iberia were somewhat entangled with local populations, as were both Greeks and Romans in their overseas settlements as well. It stands to reason that Phoenicians came from many places, that they mingled with locals across their colonial networks, that there was no pure Phoenician, and that they didn't all look alike. But what would they? Garitans, Sidonians, Dorians, Dorites, or others didn't need DNA information to be aware of both their common ground and their diversity. Ancient and modern Greeks, a word that I don't like, either modern Greeks, or for that matter, Americans, North Americans, or Spaniards, do not need genetics to tell them who they are and how they relate to their ancestral history. I guess would be that Matan felt, and hence was, just as Phoenician as any other Phoenician-speaking member of his community who grew up in a diasporic culture with eyes set both on the Levant and on the West, and with Carthage, Sardinia, and Sicily in the horizon as well as places where their kin had long ago settled. Whatever he called himself, this Matan surely had an ethnic identity, broadly speaking. I'll go back to that. Just as their neighbors recognized Phoenicians as a particular subset of Levantines, we can be pretty sure that they also recognized each other by their shared language, their distinctive set of gods, religious symbols, and rituals, practices, their singular forms of art, and as citizens of a specific constellation of Phoenician settlements. Other less tangible aspects of their culture, such as clothing, ethnic food, social customs, and music, and use of technology would have been important markers of affinity or difference as well, many of which we cannot easily recover. Still, we have plenty of evidence for the people whom our earliest Greek authors referred to as Phoenician. Their language was spoken or written for over a millennia until Augustus' time in the Levant, in North Africa until late antiquity, possibly until the Islamic conquest. But narratives about them come down to us in texts written and transmitted by others. They remain, therefore, a sidekick to Greek, Roman, and biblical histories. Archaeologists, epigraphists, and historians are still fascinated by the challenge of extracting the Phoenicians from this externally imposed framework and to reconstruct their history in their own terms. A task that many of you here are contributing to. Yet coming to terms with the Phoenicians poses methodological problems, again, many of which you know. Mainly this is due to the simple fact that their own body of literature is lost. That is where narratives containing ideas about a collective past usually manifest themselves. In short, inscriptions are the wrong medium for this. And literature is the right one, which they wrote in papyrus, which are not preserved. The bullae I mentioned are just a material proof that they did exist, so we knew that. Before turning to our Phoenicians, therefore, it is worth reflecting a little bit more on how tricky it is to discuss identities, especially ancient ones. Identities are always complex and composed of multiple layers simultaneously, whether family, religious, civic, national, gender, professional. Ancient identities are even more difficult to pin down, given our limited and mediated access to the ancient experience, especially when it comes to individual identities. We are inevitably restricted to the more general levels of group identities based on the identification of a common culture through either material culture or habits or discourses, either internal or external ethnographies. Our texts mostly give us identities in bulk, which does not mean that individuals or subgroups could not push against them, also, again, general categories to which they were subject. As John and Jean Kamaroff put it, so sometimes I will mention something you can look at bibliography, but what we call ethnicity is no more than, quote, the taken for granted species of collective subjectivity that lies at the intersection of identity and culture, end of quote. In other words, ethnicity is both ascriptive and instrumental, and as I say, both innate and constructed, both blood and choice. But blood meaning a sense of ancestry. We can distinguish different levels of identity too, between symbolic ethnicities and durable ethnicities. The symbolic ones are commodifiable, more malleable, and subject to change, while the durable ethnicities, by contrast, are more resilient and entrenched. They are the ones we receive and are predetermined by attachment to a location and territory, a family, a community. And they're difficult to break from, at least not without painful consequences. Phoenician identities span the whole range. But the Phoenicians have suffered from a rather dichotomized treatment in this respect. We have gone kind of from a 19th century mentality of taking them for granted or reading sources uncritically and not questioning things to kind of the opposite. to which I will return. Only in the 1990s, for instance, for the Greek world, classical scholars caught up with the issue of ethnic identity studies and started applying them to antiquity. Jonathan Hall, my advisor, his two books, Ethnic Identity in Greek Antiquity from 1997 and Hellenicity, Between Ethnicity and Culture in 2002, raised the bar to a new level of understanding ancient Greek identity and ethnicity as cultural constructs. But here's the difference. When it came to the Greeks, the question was never whether they were Greeks or there were Greeks, or we should or not use that name, which by the way is the Roman name, or what this meant in different contexts, or rather it was about what it meant in different contexts, historical and discursive, how they constructed, sustained, and adjusted and performed their Greekness or their Hellenicity. This kind of analysis has only recently turned to the Phoenicians, or rather turned on them. Instead of discussing how, by what cultural mechanisms, Phoenicians around the Mediterranean curated their group identity, a recent trend has chosen to pursue a total deconstruction of the Phoenicians, arguing that the lack of internal narratives, due again, loss of sources, probably, or a securely internal ethnonym, reveals that the category is artificial and never corresponded to a group or indeed a people at all. To which I'll come back. I keep going. A related criticism has to do with an alleged invention of the Phoenicians by a handful of influential scholars, such as Sabatino Muscati, most famously, a feat of scholarly ethnogenesis that fundamentally shaped the way we understand and interpret that culture. So what I want to convey is, I think that a middle ground must be found for the Phoenicians in the spectrum of ancient identity studies. It should not be the case that in order to gain a more critical view of the Phoenicians, we have to reject this existence of such a group altogether, or to use only micro categories by city or by site, or to replace the attested ancient ethnonym Phoenician with another term, for instance, Levantines, a wholly modern term. The first proposal ignores the obvious continuities and shared traits that generated the ancient category in the first place. Would we argue that we should get rid of the term Greeks or Hellenic? After all, there is very little to show for a self-conscious pan-Hellenic identity before the 5th century BC. That would require sticking to the terms Achaeans, Danans, and Argives when we discuss Homer, for instance, since he never uses the term Greeks or Hellenes in that sense. Indeed, one could argue, if we go that route, that Homer recognized the group identity of the Phoenicians, but not that of the Greeks, since he does use the term Phoenicians. But this epic was probably intentionally archaizing, thus avoiding the term Greeks, to evoke the more fragmented political realm of the Bronze Age, of the Mycenaean Bronze Age. While Homer had no reason to use any other name than Phoenicians, sometimes Sidonians to be more precise, than the one by which they were called by his own contemporaries, whoever Homer was. So anyway, this debate is not the only way in which the Phoenicians have been put on the spot in recent scholarship. There are a lot of welcome developments. For instance, the Phoenicians have become especially relevant for the study of the Mediterranean as a diachronic framework of analysis, which has seen a surge of studies since Horden and Purcell's The Corrupting Sea in 2000. And there have been a lot of books on that line, Cyprian Broodbank's Making of the Middle Sea, Joe Manning's book, Tamar Hodos's recent book, you have them in the bibliography, Dalit Rege's book. Anyway, this trend forces us to widen our focus outside the classical cultures and their histories, and to explore the interactions within that shared space. Network theory and other approaches born from post-colonial studies have also taken on a pan-Mediterranean approach. And interest in the concept of cultural hybridization and globalization have brought the Phoenicians to the fore as important agents in the knitting of networks across this Middle Sea and even into the Atlantic. At the other end of the interpretive spectrum, archaeology has boosted the micro-studies of Phoenician and indigenous interactions, such as in Iberia or in Sardinia, at the local level, again, interpreted through post-colonial lenses, paying attention to the local side. And on top of that, ongoing work in Lebanon and the adjacent areas of coastal Syria and northern Israel, where we are, with Haifa at the helm, are shedding new light on the character of Phoenician communities, their connections with the Western settlements and the Levant, and their continuities with the Canaanite world of the Bronze Age. All that is happening. So much is happening in Phoenician studies. Meanwhile, as I said earlier, in the parallel universe of theoretical inquiry, the Phoenicians have been the subject to heavy deconstruction. The trend has come mainly from classicists and art historians. For those of you who are not familiar with the main argument, maybe, though many of you I know are, but for those of you who aren't, here goes, it goes as follows. Since our literary sources are external, Greek for the early period, and we can't be sure of how the Phoenicians refer to themselves as a group in the early period, at least it is best to assume that the ethnonym is a Greco-Roman projection and does not map onto a real group. Moreover, epigraphy shows that inhabitants of the cities and areas that are identified by them as Phoenician identify primarily with their families via patronymics, their cities, with institutional positions, with religious groups, or as devotees or of particular gods. As if that was not enough. Hence, we might conclude that the Phoenicians never really cared or consider themselves as having a shared ethnic identity. But here's where comparison and attention to what media survives can give a crucial perspective. If we were to look at archaic, even classical Greek epigraphy, how frequently are claims of Hellenicity expressed there? Civic and family affiliations dominate, whereas graffiti are usually not concerned with higher level group identities. Even when we have literary texts, it is debatable what establishes the existence of a pan-Hellenic identity. And something that this is not a relevant idea until the Persian Wars for the Greeks. Scholars often fall back on what the father of Greek history, Herodotus, believed to be the main reason why the Athenians did not ally with the Persians to attack their fellow Greeks. It's worth quoting this passage to see the context. I quote Herodotus, book 8. The reasons preventing us from doing this are many and great, even if we wanted to. First and above all, the burning and destruction of the statues and temples of the gods, whom we are obligated to avenge to the highest degree, and then the Hellenic community, to Hellenikon, being one of shared kinship and shared language, as well as the common shrines and sacrifices for the gods and our similar costumes, for all of which it would be not seemly for the Athenians to become traitors. End of quote. A perception of shared ancestry, shared language, gods and rituals, and customs in general. In the Greek world, all this left room for local variation, both linguistic, actual dialects among the Greeks, and religious. To the best of our knowledge, this was exactly the case among the Phoenician cities, if anything with less variation, for instance, linguistically or perhaps religiously. These basic ethnic markers are enough for a people or even in a discontinuous territory, for instance, across the sea, to identify with each other, at least as distinct from others at crucial times. Political unity or independence were not sine qua non for collective identity. And in fact, they rarely overlap neatly with ethnic identities in the ancient world and today. But the thorniest issue of the critics seems to be the external origin of the ethnonym Phoenician. For some reason, people have really become obsessed with this. Let's face it, it is what we have. And we use ethic or external names all the time and terms all the time. They are unavoidable. What matters for historians is not to accept them without critical scrutiny, which we definitely have done. And if they are functionally useful, to make sure we use them in a way that avoids historical distortion. We are far from that risk with the Phoenicians. As it happens, it is fairly easy to quite precisely map the ancient authors category onto the very ones that we would have created without their help, just by existing epigraphical and archaeological evidence. In other words, peoples from a particular set of lands who shared a particular language and script, religious landscapes, a political trajectories at times, and material culture just happens to match with the Roman category of Phoenician. The problem, in short, and again, I'm making my case in the strongest terms I can, but I don't pretend to be too preachy, but to put it in a slightly preachy way, it's not so much the invention of the Phoenicians as the academic invention of a problem, in my view. We all have read or even echoed by inertia the idea that the Phoenician reference is confusing and difficult to pin down. It has become almost a cliche, a requisite to surround the Phoenicians with caveats and hedging and scare quotes. But we don't do this regularly with any other well-textually attested Iron Age group. There is a category way more problematic, right? Anyway, to quote a colleague, not a group who has worked on the Phoenicians in the Aegean, she put it very well when she said that scholarship swung from an uncritical pre-World War II assumption of permanent Phoenician presence in the Aegean, colonization and all that, to the opposite point, where the issue of contacts in the Aegean was confronted with skepticism, and everything about the Phoenician presence in the Aegean had to be followed by a question mark. In recent works, again, often not by Semitists, but by classicists or historians, I'm kind of throwing stones in my own field of classics, but one can find sometimes also vague or misleading assessments of the Phoenician language. And fine, not everybody has got into Semitic comparative philology, I understand that. But it gets misrepresented, I think, as sometimes as difficult. I'm actually saying things that have been impressed. Difficult, largely consonantal language, assertions that rehash Orientalist impressions of Arabic and other Semitic languages, in my view. In some cases, authors may doubt whether the Phoenicians shared a language at all. Other blanket dismissals include the idea that they did not share a pantheon, or that the Phoenician art of the Iron Age is an invention of modern scholarship, or represent them as a dislocated people that belong nowhere, allegedly seen by ancient authors such as Homer or Herodotus as peoples of the sea and the like. These kinds of statements are not necessarily ill-intended or anything. They come from different interests and fields, but they have created a generalized climate of insecurity that leads others to place Phoenicians in quotation marks, even when reporting what the ancient sources said about them. But they do not likewise use scare quotes for Persians or Greeks or Etruscans, let alone cultures with wholly made up names and categories such as Minoans or sea people. This hodgepodge of vague impressions and distortions does not correspond with our epigraphic, archaeological, or even internal Phoenician literary evidence, slim though the last category may be. And I have written about that in some other places. I don't have to. But the ancient authors, from historiographers to philosophers and poets, are more often than not quite specific and not hazy or ambiguous at all. They use the ethnonym Phoenician in a way that maps fairly precisely to the culture that modern specialists identify as distinctive enough, and therefore use that name. I really don't see the issue. The convergence of ancient textual evidence and modern archaeology and linguistics at this point is quite striking, in fact. To be fair, it is our duty to be critical of sources and to avoid methodological pitfalls and so on. Sure, it's a good exercise. The question is whether we want to problematize the concept to the point of disintegration. By doing so, we merely replace the problem of the Phoenicians' external representation by Greeks and Romans with a modern version. But even a look at the most relevant Greek sources produces a completely contrary image. To mention Herodotus again, his representation of the Phoenicians in the histories is very consistent as a group associated with the cities we know in the Levant, including coastal Israel and abroad. Cadiz, Tyre, all these places. This is a people known for their seafaring prowess, as is so often stressed. Recently, he made a book, but also for their technological and religious knowledge in its transmission, especially in relation to connections between Greeks and Egyptians. The Phoenicians are always entangled in that. It's very interesting. This is not, does not signify a scattered nature, but rather it is part of their group identity, I would say. A quality exploited by them and identified by others of kind of mediating. Now, the other main problem is used by the deconstructionists is the lack of a national identity and political unity among Phoenician communities. But again, the same argument is never used to abolish the historicity of the Greek people, who were likewise fragmented among independent and often hostile city-states until they were engulfed by later empires. In his politics, Aristotle states as much when he proclaims, I quote, that the race, ethnos, of the Greeks has the potential to rule everybody else if only they happen to be a single state. And of course, he was by the side of Alexander, who did exactly that. And then he goes on to speak about the diversity among the Greek ethne. This passage is not often cited. The Phoenicians crossed the Mediterranean and have a similar history, with the difference that the language did disappear after a certain point, unlike the Greek language. But so did Akkadian, spoken Hebrew in a sense, Etruscan, Iberian languages. In a modern, moreover, they never had a modern nation state that was built on the basis of that language or that territory. It is assumed that lacking political unity, other shared aspects were not sufficient to delineate a collective identity. But why? The Phoenicians remain a phantom, invented, a mythical community, at least in some recent publications. But to be sure, we lack Phoenician texts that articulate such an identity, at least until later times. But again, I am convinced that is because their literature and those kinds of narratives are just not preserved, as neither are most of ancient people's narratives. The exception are the Greeks. The contemporary Greeks, with whom the Phoenicians have so much in common, also organized themselves into city-states. They didn't have a set homeland, nor their colonial realm was confined by fixed political boundaries. Why are they not phantom or invented or mythical? There is a double standard there. It is, of course, possible to see this deconstructive trend as a mere intellectual exercise, I've believed by its own proponents, maybe. The national identity argument, it seems, it speaks against a straw man. You know what a straw man is? A ghost of sclerotic 19th century views of history. Who was the last one who said in an unqualified way that there was a single Phoenician state or nation state? Even Ernest Renan, the French Orientalist and father of the archaeological exploration of Phoenician sites, understood that nationhood was culturally constructed, and he saw the Phoenicians as a nation, in quotation marks, that is a people with distinctive culture and art, but not a country. So whose allegedly naive views of the Phoenicians' nationality are being critiqued? I don't know. So again, think of the Greeks or the Israelites. It is clear that whether they had a state or not in a given point is not what makes them a group or a people in the historical record. It is again a matter of whether we have preserved narratives about their peoplehood, their identity, which nourish the social and religious backbone of a community. I would argue, in fact, that we have a slanted view of Phoenician collective identity precisely because the bundle of texts that were privileged and cherished for educational and religious reasons in the West. That's what we have. The survival of such corpus, such as the classical corpus or the biblical one, is the anomaly, not the norm. A Byzantine, drawing from my Byzantine sources, I like this quotation from a Byzantine statesman and intellectual, Theodoros Metochites, who in the 14th century said, "For how many countries, cities, and men performed feats similar to those of the Greeks, but did not find anyone to write about them." The lack of an all-encompassing state was typical among most Iron Age cultures. Within those parameters, the Phoenicians held together culturally through a remarkable longue durée with lasting continuity. Their social identity conforms by all standards to quote, a self-conceptualization predicated on perceptions of similarity and difference, which may also be affected by external perceptions that feed into it, just like any other culture. That's quoting Jonathan Hall. In his monograph, Hall captured in the title all of these in a very few words: Hellenicity between ethnicity and culture. This could equally be postulated for Phoenicity, a term that actually Becky Martin has proposed in a recent article. The problem with the current deconstruction of Phoenicity is that it does not seem to take its analysis through the full cycle, like it did with Hellenicity. It leaves the Phoenicians hanging out there at the bottom of the deconstruction. But there is no reason why we cannot approach their identity in a reconstructed way. In the case of the Phoenicians, the historical and tragic loss of their literature has been turned into an argument against this identity, an argument from silence, if ever there was one, as its own proponents have admitted. We will never know how the lost sources represented Phoenician identity, but at least we know there was a large body of literature which Greeks and Romans read extensively and which they referred to as Phoenician. We have those testimonies, again, written somewhere else. Actually, my talk in Tel Aviv was more about those testimonies. Indeed, seeing that we only have a small portion of Greco-Roman texts, it is remarkable that we have any Phoenician literature quoted at all and so many references to Phoenician authors, which we do. But the little we have leaves no doubt that there were ancient traditions springing from Phoenician communities themselves that connected their religions and their mythologies to each other, and which promoted a sense of belonging to a broader group and its difference to others. Consider the transmitted foundation myth of colonization narratives of Tyre, Carthage, and Gadir, which are the only ones we have, or the myths of creation that we have quotes from, even in late versions. They amount to a declaration of kinship between the motherland and the Western colonies. Especially telling is how Carthage apparently dodged a Persian invasion because the Phoenician naval contingents from the Levant, hired by the Persian king, refused the orders to attack Carthage. Their refusal was based, according to Herodotus again, on kinship and religious ties. I quote, since they were bound by strong oaths and they would not be acting piously if they attacked their own children. Paidastus Theoton, end of quote. Again, ties, kinship and religious, a sense of religious ties. This sentiment resonates with the statement about the Athenians and the Persians in the same context for the Greeks. But that statement is showcased by classical scholars as the strongest declaration of Greek identity, but the one about the Phoenicians and Carthage, also vis-a-vis Persians, is dismissed, resorting to very forced arguments. That is the type of inconsistency that they are subjected to. Similar sentiments of Phoenicity lie behind historical developments later on too. For instance, Hannibal's reputation as a Phoenician leader seems to have played a role in his successful recruitment of a Phoenician fleet in Asia Minor after the Punic Wars, when he was on exile. And the sustained ritual and civic relationships between Carthage and Gadir and Tyre, which is attested, also signal the same religious networks as Corinne Bonnet and Manuel Alvarez and Maria Eugenia Obed have discussed. What then prevents us from recognizing the Phoenicians as a valid, albeit always critically analyzed category? As a classicist, I can say the answer must lie in the complex position that they hold vis-a-vis the Greeks and classical culture, on the one hand, and to some degree to Israel and biblical studies on the other. The historiography of ancient Israel, in fact, has gone through its own deconstructive phase, which you know more about than me. a version of the deconstruction of the Phoenicians tries to compare these two cases. The comparison, to argue that the Phoenicians also were not a unified or homogeneous people either. I don't want to get into that, but the comparison with Israel, just to point out, the point is kind of misleading. Why? Because we have to recognize that the exercise is different when we try to reconstruct the history of groups that do not map onto modern states, national and religious narratives. After the exercise of the construction is complete, neither the concept of the Greeks nor the concept of Israel is going anywhere, both because of the existence of modern states and also because both peoples and their texts are essential building blocks for the cultural genealogy of the West. We all know that. The Phoenicians, on the contrary, remain state orphans with little protagonism in modern nationalist movements in the countries most tied to their legacy. That would be Tunisia and Lebanon, the ones that map more onto those capitals, right? Hence, they can be subjected to the construction with no or little pushback. In the end, it would seem that the threshold of scholarly admission into peoplehood is the survival of a body of classical texts relevant to the construction of the West and the existence of a modern state. And I've been a bit dramatic here, but Phoenician deconstruction might have been a necessary rite of passage for a young discipline, a mostly archaeological discipline, or to some degree, to a good degree, at least young compared to classical and biblical studies, whose grip it does not seem to be able to escape. The recent debate certainly requires and brings us to a more nuanced discussion of the Phoenicians, and we are all thankful for that. But after a certain point, I find the path of the construction rather paralyzing, leading to a dead end. So in the rest of my talk, I want to suggest some ways towards a more reconstructed view of Phoenician cultural history and their collective identity. Phoenicians are actually remarkably easy to identify in general. When asked to write about Phoenician aspects of history and culture for reference works, and I know this because I edited the Phoenician Handbook of the Mediterranean, most authors have no trouble finding their corpus. They know what their corpus of evidence is for each of the fields, even with all its gaps and problems. For scholars who are immersed in the complex puzzle of the ancient Near East, these debates are kind of pointless. The Levant, the category itself, might denote a relatively small geographical area of Western Asia, but throughout its complex and convulsive history, it has been buzzing with a fairly distinct amount of cultures, religions, languages, and scripts. So for the Iron Age, scholars specialize in different areas and distinguish between Phoenician culture in the record and those of other groups in general, and their overlaps and their interactions. So instead of obsessing about the gaps in our knowledge about the Phoenicians, interesting though they are, we can look for group identity in the abundant and resilient shared traits. This is what traditional archaeology, art history, and historiography did, kind of automatically, triggering the eventual reaction, and call for reanalysis of the category. So some of you are very aware of these threads, but I will try to go kind of quickly through them and just highlight some of them. The main one, script and language. Script and language are very essential to group identities. And a Phoenician script and language were used with relatively little variation until Augustus' time in the Levant and until the 5th century CE in North Africa. This script appears consistently in all areas of Phoenician settlement and commercial presence, from the Aegean, Levant, Cilicia, Malta, Iberia, etc. Just as scholars attribute the eventual adoption and differentiation of Hebrew, Aramaic, Moabite, Greek script, to the formation of their own separate identities. So we should consider the consistency of the language and script as a sign of purposeful cultural expression, and probably within an administrative political dimension too, which linked these areas. There is a huge debate about also Phoenician art. I am with Joseph Elagis and others in thinking that despite its detractors, Phoenician art existed and was original. There is a general perception that it was very eclectic, especially marked by Egyptianizing streak, but to the trained eye, like those of Glenn Marco or Goubel, this eclecticism is its most distinctive feature. Becky Martin's book has done an excellent job in highlighting this for the Persian period and onwards, but I think I see the same traits in the earlier phases. So as she would point out, the lack of our distinctiveness, it's not their lack of distinctiveness, but our lack of sensibility as to their particular idioms that is the problem. The gods about the gods and goddesses that are invoked in Phoenician sites are certainly identifiable as Phoenician gods from Tyre to Malta to Gadir, with hypostases and variants and regional preferences and city preferences, as much as for the Greek. One could say the same. There is no one Greek pantheon, but definitely they did have the same gods and variants. They're very traditional and also conservative in theophoric names, which is very symbolic of religion. Among them, Melkart, who was the Baal or the Lord of Fire, is prominent as particularly important, linking this axis of the Phoenician network. And the religious aspect shows in symbology. A traveler will have seen same recurrent religious symbols across the Phoenician diaspora, and as well as shared funerary rituals with variation, in time and space, sure, but not undistinctive, and use of amulets with same symbologies and repeated iconography and so on. The Phoenician institutions, such as the Sufetes, as a magistracy, the Matseach associations, and others were used by Tyrians and Carthaginians for more than 1,000 years. Many of them survived in North Africa until imperial times. You have Matseach, you have Baalim, you have certain Sufetes. It has also been noticed that the Carthaginians chose the palm tree or phoenix as a symbol of their first minted coins in the 1st century BC. Again, without getting too much into it, in a highly contested arena of the central Mediterranean, such as in Sicily, it is difficult to see this as less than a self-generated projection of a collective identity that matched a long-standing tradition of Greek representation. That is saying, yes, we are Phoenicians and we love it. That's really. What about the evidence of the internal use of the ethnonym Phoenicians? Besides the use of the palm tree, there is a handful of testimonies that come from bilingual contexts in classical times and later, because again, that's the Greek name, so you have to have a Greek source. For instance, one Shem, son of Abdashtart, the In his epitaph, he invokes the motherland, Ashkelon, and also says he left behind Phoenicia, uses that term. In a 6th century BC ivory token of hospitality written in Etruscan and found in Carthage, someone wrote, I am Puni or Puniel from Carthage, and so on. There are a handful of testimonies, not many, until you get to later sources. Why? Because that's where we have more literature preserved, where the Phoenician identifier is much more frequent. In Roman times, it was used. So even if we take this as intellectual allusions in Roman times, at a minimum, they also reveal a sense of cultural legacy. Now, the jury is still out there about the Canaanite term, whether it was used by Phoenicians as a Semitic name, since it appears associated with inhabitants of North Africa and their language in Augustus' time. Besides that, there are a handful of testimonies of the New Testament. Beirut is called the mother of Canaan in coins, in Hellenistic coins. But very interestingly, I think, the Roman period author Philo of Byblos was conscientious of the Canaanite association and a shift between Canaanite and Phoenician. He's writing in Greek about Phoenician history and religion, and he says that in a sort of mythology he says that Hanas, Canaan, was the one who first changed his name to Phoenix. So he has an eponym called Hanas and says that he changed his name. So again, the idea of Canaanite as a self-referent, at least, was a thing in Roman times. Why does this matter? To draw closer to my conclusions, in a nutshell, by treating the Phoenicians as some scattered, incoherent amalgam, we strip them of agency while increasing the already crippling gap between them and the Greeks and Romans. By not taking their agency seriously, we've failed to understand a lot of things that happened in the first millennium BC. If we want to understand the geopolitical factors that shaped Mediterranean culture, even in its later phases, and even in the Roman expansion, and we want to unveil the cultural dynamics behind the emergence of Iron Age urban cultures, we need to come out of our Hellenocentric shell and pay more attention, not less, to the Phoenicians. Yeah, by other people's own admission, especially the Greeks, the Phoenicians were very important points of reference in multiple ways, for the Romans as well. I mean, they owed them the becoming an imperial power in the West. This type of study has already been ongoing, as I said, and you might say, but even the trends of network theory and Mediterranean studies that I mentioned are not the most conducive to the discussion of particular groups. One sometimes feels that the historical agents are kind of diluted in the sea of moving artifacts and trading routes. The Mediterranean networks take their place, propelled by invisible causes, while human agents and political geodynamics take a backseat. It's almost like the sea has become a historical protagonist by itself. But back to the beginning, Matan would have been more readily, probably would have responded more readily to someone asking him if he was a Phoenician or a Canaanite than to someone asking him if he was a Mediterranean seafarer. For all we know, he was a farmer. When we create a vacuum like this, the peoples whom we know best, because of the sources, the Greeks and the Romans, will automatically fill the gaps in our ongoing reconstructions of ancient history. So instead of denying the Phoenicians' historical existence because they do not rise to the level of evidence provided by their peers, we can note the similarities of their colonial enterprises and their interactions with local groups and try to reconstruct what they were doing. We can analyze the Phoenicianizing process, the word process that Ayelen has also promoted, as we continue to problematize the collective identities of all groups, including the formation of Pan-Hellenism. But it is striking that of all the Canaanite offspring cultures that diversified into different groups in the Iron Age, such as Israelites or Moabites or others, Only the Phoenicians are repeatedly subject to the scapegoats. Why? Because they're too close to the Greeks, in my view. They're too close to the classical world. In short, identity matters, words matter, the ones we use, the ones they use, narratives matter, and especially in our days, we are seeing, actually, in our current world, we're being reminded of that. Like other abstract social phenomena, race, gender, identity, group identity, and individual is among those categories that are both unreal and have real consequences. I have to explain this to my daughter recently about race. I think it was like, it's not a thing, it's not real, but it is real in terms that it has consequences. But disciplinary self-consciousness on the issue, on the terror of being accused of theoretical naivete, has driven many to avoid the notion, the category, or some to deny it. I don't know what Matan called himself, but it is unthinkable that he did not feel part of a broader group defined by ancestry, language, territory, place, religion, and customs. He would have frowned at the idea that identities in his period were in flux or thin and malleable. This idea has more to do with our Western 21st century liberal concerns, but it also disregards the enormous gap in our knowledge about the hard aspects of identities now and in the past, such as legal and political frameworks that individuals lived in often. And yet another argument is that it was not in the Iron Age, but in later times that identities hardened or consolidated when we enter historical periods. But the circularity is evident. Those historical periods and history itself is so defined because of text. So our lack of written evidence for the Iron Age should not be confused with the absence of identities, especially because the groups that came out identityless are precisely those who did not have the advantage of a manuscript tradition to illuminate our knowledge of their perception of their collective past. So it's all very circular. Archaeology has a huge role to play in this reconstruction because of the lack of text, but always, I think, in dialogue with these historical issues. So to finish, deliberately or not, this selective deconstruction of the Phoenicians only reinforces a view of the ancient world mediated and bound to the classical and biblical cultures, their textuality, and their views of others. I think I made my point. Thank you. I had to get it out of my chest at some point. That's done. Now I can move on.
And you seem to be enjoying the process.
I do.
Which is great. I would encourage the people on Zoom to type their questions on the chat box. And after we take some questions from the audience here, maybe we can read some of them there.
Sure.
I would say I regret very much that two people did not attend this talk. One, Josephine Quinn, who had received and maybe is still receiving a lot of unhappy communications. Still, I think, yeah. From Lebanon, for example. The second is David Nierenberg, who is giving a talk right now in a very different part of campus because of a mistake he made. It had to be better oriented, but yesterday, some of us attended his talk, launched a project he launched earlier, but showed it to us on seed, starting with Enlil and the early Bronze Age Mesopotamia, and ending yesterday. Then he continues with it, with the Muslims, trying to suggest that there is a very acute, much more than we imagine, awareness of race as continues through sexual intercourse and the continuation of particular traits according to various ancients much before the Jews. This is, I think, his agenda. And I was, I would wonder what he would have to say about the Phoenicians, with or without evidence for what they have to say about their own seed and the extent to which you can actually capture them also under this kind. But it would be an interesting project to continue following. maybe another useful category for us for the future. My question to you, firstly, is perhaps more as a cultural historian and an expert in the Phoenicians, because with the same peoples, they mentioned by the Etruscans, I'm recently more and more challenged by the Nabateans. I think a book can be written tomorrow about who were the Nabateans, easily. Your solution towards the end of your talk was to supply certain traits that answer critiques. To what extent can we determine historiographically, the sine qua non to make so? If we don't have political organization, but everything else is there. If we don't have a joint language, but everything else is there. To what extent we are creating our own circularity? To what extent you think that your paradigm can match other issues, or maybe it is, too broad a topic to discuss here. But I would be interested as an historian to hear.
The Nabateans, there is some Nabatean. There are Nabatean institutions and language, and there. I think language and religion are very, very important for people. But again, not all ethnic narratives or group identities map onto those two either. And again, that's because in the end, it depends on many historical developments. In each case, things can change. I couldn't think, when I was doing this, stop thinking about Ukraine these days. Like we have, all these different discourses about, or are they more close or less close to Russians, and how, and they're Orthodox, and they have they all speak Russian, this and that. And at one point they were part of. Still, I mean, they don't like being invaded or being told that they're not Ukrainians. I mean, I can't speak for them, but it's a situation where you see the complexities and still how you can have a very strong identity, or at least for a large group. So I think language, religion, but especially we're lacking the discourse, right? But we're lacking it. I'm working on that. I think that there are a lot of signs here, there in epigraphy, in mentions, in religion. There are a lot of tries to kind of reconstruct an internal sense, and they surface in later times when we have object source. But yes, we are, in the case of the Phoenicians, that's the very big challenge of the sources, but that's kind of a manufactured vacuum as well, because the Romans pretty conscious, they destroyed and manipulated unique,
that's proximity.
sources, and the Greeks have a discourse that is both sometimes antagonistic and very often not, very often admitting a kind of a cultural debt about the alphabet and the whole legends of Patmos and this and that. They have a sense of they're part of the Greek mythology, so it's almost like they're too close to be comfortable, and they are, like there's no Greek ethnography of the Phoenicians. I was talking about this yesterday with somebody. Herodotus talks about all these people, others do, but it's almost like you don't need it because you've been in contact with them, so for so long. They are everywhere, and that it's not necessary. On the other hand, I agree. If I can talk to David about this, but I think there's a bit of a return to the consciousness that a concept of race matters. Race not understood as a genetically transmitted thing, but as race, people who a sense of a lineage, right? And we have come the other way. We have come the other side. Like we have gone through the whole, race is a construct, it's not a real thing, it's not genetic. We have come all the way out the other end, seeing that people are killed for race. People kill each other because of race, for what they consider about race. So it's like we can come out of, again, we have deconstructed all of these concepts and ethnic identity, but in the end, they are real things. That people, and it's just, I think, I've read the ancient sources for the Phoenicians. I don't know if I missed any, but I really have, paid attention to how they use it, what are they referring to, and I see a very strong consistency in terms of seeing a group of people that are distinctive. So if others saw them as distinctive for so long, how were they not see each other as distinctive when they actually do speak the same language and worship the same God and use the same symbols and use the same formula, use the same names, as much as variety as you want, not more variety than within the Greek world. Again, if anything, less variety. So again, it's not, there's not a magic formula, it's not, I don't think there's a set trait, a set bag
Try
of,
to get it out of it, but I'm not managing. No?
it's not a set bag of, no, in their case, it's, I would say, religion, language, and mythologies to the degree that we can, foundation, links between certain cities, and in the long durée, you see that traits that appear in Greek sources, then the Phoenicians themselves are perfectly comfortable with them, with that identity. So, I just don't see what is the problem. It doesn't mean that we have to be stubborn about boundaries or these, and there will be plenty of gray lines, as there are for many other cultures. But there's also, I don't see the problem of referring to Phoenicians as the people from the cities where those languages and those religions, those practices and those cults are attested, when all the historical sources are telling us that that's where they were. Even if there is, we hardly have other Iron Age peoples besides the Israelites outside the classical sources that are so well attested. So, and I think we just have to move on and keep working at it and working on the nuances and the granulated study of them and all the blurry lines if you want, but without being that we can't, because we can't use the category. I think the category is established in antiquity in a pretty unproblematic way. I don't think the brains, and one thing I don't want to, I admire her a lot and respect her a lot, but she knows I don't agree on. She cannot see the glass half empty and I see it half full, and that's all, we can. So I think we probably need both. We need the debate and we need to, but I have other things to do than debating the identity anymore. Once I'm done with it.
I push down into this story.
Thank you very much. Very enlightening talk. I support your side of the argument, and thank you for this. It is very useful. It will be very useful.
Not every, then I keep thinking, I didn't put this or that. Yeah, of course, there's many more references.
Actually, I would love teaching a copy of this.
Sure.
This will get lost.
Sure.
But a question, you mentioned that you had another talk about this, and I think you're absolutely right to focus on the importance of narrative and the roles in various aspects of life. Because we don't, there are actually quite a number of references to words that we know, and I don't know, was there could you give us some examples maybe, and is there anywhere a hint of stems that if somebody from Simon is writing something, they would expect people from Biblos or Tyre or Ashkelon or wherever for that to be accessible to them as well? Is he writing to all people who can read this language? Is there anything that you can smell even in that direction?
Right.
It's very possible, I guess.
But let me give a point when we have inscriptions. It is a language that is both is similar to other not similar languages, but distinctive enough. And so we know that, and the writing is, again, very consistent, right? It diverges at one point, like Hebrew starts differentiating a little bit, and the Phoenician writing, it has no more variation than Greek writing along the centuries. So we can be pretty sure that they could read each other, and they are speaking to other people who read and speak that language. I don't think, and the Greeks talk about it and about language, but sources. So yeah, for details, I refer you to my. I wrote about Phoenician literature just to give a list of kind of things we have, but for instance, they were very well known for kind of more treatises on agriculture. This is by Roman times, of course, but there is a tradition there, obviously, that God put into a word that was translated by the Romans, and they were experts on certain things like there's travel literature, periploi, right? That is attributed to Phoenicians. There is even a text, Hanos Periplos, that was translated into Greek, part of it. But there is a whole kind of literature of the circumnavigation that the Greeks tapped into. Aristotle talks about the constitution of Carthage, comparing it to the Greek constitution legal system. So they had a legal system, they surely, had writings about it and things written about it, and so on, mythology. So there are some foundation stories. The Greeks talk about them as part of their mythology. Therefore, there must have been. I have studied in comparative mythology a lot of these cosmogonic themes, where you have motifs that appear in Ugaritic, and then they appear in Philo in Roman times, and they are like very specific motifs, names that, with similarities to the Hebrew Bible. You can tell there is a background that we're missing because we don't have the text, right? Where there were mythical traditions that were regional, that had Canaanite heritage, which seemed to be very tied to Phoenician religion and gods and names. And those names appear in inscriptions and names of the same gods. So it's a matter, it's kind of a complex puzzle that is there. And then in late antiquity, you have this long tradition about the Phoenicians grouping them with other peoples of the book, like the most ancient mythologies and cosmologies, the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, and the Phoenicians. And why are they there? The whole tradition about the alphabet, the papyrus, the biblos, right? They were people who wrote, and the writing circulated. And by the time Philo or biblos, like Josephus, is writing a history of these people, sure, he's a Roman, he's writing in Greek, so is Josephus. Why do we take Josephus as well? He's capturing very interesting traditions of the Jewish people that have been passed, through the centuries, but when it comes to Philo Biblos, it's like, it's an intellectual, artificial exercise. I don't think, you can argue that, but you can argue the opposite. You can say, well, you can actually see very interesting things going on there that show you that there has been a written tradition for many centuries, and that they were playing with it, and he was conveying it in a different approach. Euhemerism and all that, very sophisticated, but still he's conveying a Phoenician tradition called Phoenician. So he's speaking to a broader realm of people who were attuned to that, for whom that meant something, even as a cultural baggage. So anyway, I can send you more, stuff. They're contemporary.
So take a
Yes.
look and some turn now into the virtual group. More questions here. Beatrice, please.
Good question. We should talk more about Cyprus. Cyprus is so interesting, and it's a case where you have, I think, a very strong Phoenician presence. Many centuries, Phoenicia in particular, lots of inscriptions, the language, art, sanctuary spots, but also within a context that is very idiosyncratic. Cypriot, you also have Greeks, but there is a very strong indigenous substratum, cultural religious substratum that is very strong. It's prehistory. So it's one of those cases where you can both study Phoenician culture abroad and its interaction with the locals. And Cyprus has provided a lot of very important.
Inhabitants of Kitian, I'm repeating for the
Kitian? Yeah, I would, to the degree that, of Kitian, some group, Kitian would be the most clear, but again, not all of the inhabitants of Kitian, what do I know, right? But okay, the ones that are, that are writing in Phoenician and that are worshiping Ashtoreth and that. Yes, I would say they're Phoenicians. I don't see what the color is using that for in the terms that we understand it through Levant. Yeah. But in Cyprus, what you have is also in many places, groups, I mean, probably pockets of Phoenicians living alongside, and intermingling with Cypriot, with Greeks, and in Italian, you have archives that have Greek and Phoenician language side by side. These kingdoms that were sometimes we're talking about Persian period and later, right? Later on, they go back and forth between Phoenician administration and Greek administration. They fight. So there is a very complex picture there where you do have Phoenician definitely, and you have Greek Cypriots, and you have now. Are all of them Cypriot? Is that identity of the island? I don't think that's incompatible necessarily, right? Like they may all have shared a Cypriot identity at one point, and for different people that will be more important than their community Phoenician or. Exactly. We have the same problem or interesting problem in Iberia, where you have this situation too. You have settlements that are largely Phoenician, you have settlements that are largely indigenous, and then you have this culture kind of in between, what we call Tartessic, and what are they, and so again, these levels of identities, right?
Look at the names of the Hasmonean, for example, and how they go Greek and then Jewish again.
And then people will highlight, I mean, again, it's like we're in the blind. I'm not saying you have to put a blanket on everybody's Phoenician. No, I'm saying that I see the problem of speaking of Phoenicians, then you can fine tune and people highlight. Then at some point they will highlight one identity or another. I know that as a Spaniard who has lived in the United States for many, many years, and when I'm there, I feel more Spanish than ever, I'm Spanish. When I'm in Spain, I feel Spanish, but I also feel a bit foreign, you know what I mean? Or what depends where I am. I mean, you highlight one thing or another, but there are certain traits, durable ethnicity, let's say, that if you ask me, like, I'll tell you where my mother was from, where my father was from, where my family is, and my background is, you know what I mean? It's all complex.
Yeah.
Two comments and a question. The first as regards network, I agree with you completely. But once scholars got the idea of networks, then identity disappeared. The other networks, everybody doesn't matter where you are, they want to collaborate, doesn't,
globalization.
The past all no identity, and we as scholars should not be interested in identity. By the way, I think that part of the identity was race, as in DNA identity, because people have different colors of skin and hair, and humans of bears, like mentions, and so let's not forget, this is really
Yes.
People didn't pay attention that this guy is white and whatever.
There were stereotypes existed, whether they correspond to ours, like by skin color or not, or different things, but stereotypes definitely existed.
So, networks is an easy way out. The second comment regards identity under the planet. I think that what should be taken into consideration is that identity before and after the Babylonian context of the catastrophic events are different. So when studying ancient Israel, it's obvious. Before and after that, I think, and Becky Mountain, by the way, this is something she's saying, identity on the coast is quite different. Something different. And the question is concerns to me, or since to me this is a Western novelty, although barring the one perhaps we need to select that. Can you pinpoint the earliest Phoenician inscription encountered when, in the face of course, when are the earliest? Are there any earlier ones?
That's a good question. I will have to go to the Carthage, to go back to see my sense. I mean, definitely probably in the top, you have been the earliest attestations, and I don't know what was the earliest Yeah, I have to check. I don't want to kind of make it up. I would say, I don't know. I don't want to say it because at least classical archaic, that's really not super early, but it is it's one of those mysteries. I think that if she was in the Levant, clearly she was not a big, it might have gone that way instead, right? From that to, and there's, we don't know, right? But it's possible that it clearly is a type of name, and I think it's an goddess that kind of gets merged with a start in Carthage in that area. And the origin, may have been even a local, North Africa, something local merging with, like, with the Carthaginian pantheon, in the same way that, in Iberia, South Iberia, you have places of worship where you see there's a statuette of Astarte in El Carambol or in Seville, but we don't know if the goddess worshipped there by a local what's called Astarte. It might have been called whatever. We don't know. The local goddess that. So there are all these assimilations. I'm very interested in this, and like religion, I thought really is like a node, another point for assimilations and adaptations and distinctions, right? So my sense would be that wherever she came from, some stratum of maybe North African culture, maybe, I don't know, I don't think we know, but for instance, or maybe from the Levant, that's a goddess that was not a main thing, and then it became kind of partly assimilated to Astarte, or partly assimilated, so at least the same content, the same epithet, the symbols are shared, like Titanic or stars in the same description as the same. So I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question. Like, what is the earliest? I don't know. I would say, yeah, but it's a good point about the networks. I feel the same. I love it because I love the transcultural, transnational trend, right? But then, since I was looking into Phoenicians, for instance, and this is like, yeah, but where is the, there's people doing things and making decisions. Sometimes the decision of one individual, a king or changes the course of history, right? I mean, and that is not in the network. That is individual agency and power, and so every trend is interesting. But for the Phoenicians, it's kind of, they kind of fall between the cracks of many disciplines, and that's the thing.
Dr. Dylan James, a postdoctoral fellow now in New Zealand, would like, must be getting later, huh? Wants to ask a question about language. Hi, Dylan. Before the Koine, it's also on the board. Before the Koine, the Greeks had different dialects and also an abstract sense of a common language. How much consistency or regional variation can we see in Phoenician language?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So, there is some variation. I mean, and I'm expressed like, I recommend the chapter in my handbook by Maria Malassi, because she's such an expert. So I follow her. And if you look at that chapter, you get this sense that, yeah, there is some variation, like at some point there's some phonetic changes we can see, as you might expect over hundreds of years, or there's some, the writing changes a little bit geographically and by time, but it's still the same writing. So again, the same as the Greek, but there is no such stark difference as between the Greek dialects. I studied dialects for a while, where you have, the Ionian groups and the Dorian groups have pretty strong difference, like how the infinitive form is different. A lot of the phonetic clusters are different. It's pretty, and they make fun of each other for it in the comedies. They still largely understood each other. And they understood that was Greek as opposed to Egyptian or Aramean, or, right? In general. But maybe some didn't understand each other. But so I think there is less variation, if that's a helpful. So it's pretty remarkable, because that talks about a diaspora that was probably fairly, but fairly, maybe fairly homogeneous. I don't know if homogeneous is the right word, but a diaspora that was pretty consistent in terms of culture being having a same language, and then and then some with some time there's some. But the other problem we have with the language is that since they didn't write vowels, I mean the same as Hebrew, right? With Hebrew you have a Masoretic tradition and it's spoken, right? But with Phoenician we don't have anybody to tell us exactly how I don't know where I'm looking. Sorry, I keep looking, sorry. We don't have, so it's very hard to know the vocalization, right? So when you have bilingual inscriptions or Greek names that are adapting Phoenician names, you can see how they heard them. So there is some traces of vocalic changes, but not so much. So what I would say is that it is easy to read from Hebrew because it's a frequent question. Sure, if you know Hebrew or if you know Aramaic or Arabic, I mean, not that difficult to make it up. But there are tons of hapaxes like words that don't appear. Hebrew for one thing, but also they also may seem more similar because we don't have the vocalization, right? So if you see,
It's an object.
exactly, you see Milkiaton. I don't know. I mean, if you're reading Hebrew, you say Milkiatan or you say Melekiatan. But we know that there was the vocalization for stress A was turned to O it was like kind of secondary canonization. So the definition had. So there are particular features. The article is different and grammatical things, but it's incompletely attested, right? So it's hard, but it's attested enough to see that it is a language that is different enough than other contemporary ones. And even if it's very similar in terms of identities, we have to be careful because if it's distinctive enough, like I can say that Catalan is similar to Castilian. I can understand Catalan, but I'm not going to tell my Catalan friend that it's the same language. There is, I mean, people really feel strongly even about dialectal differences, so we have to respect that.
Appropriate, I think, fun. And once again, many thanks.
Thank you all.